I promise I'm back. Good afternoon once again. Welcome to today's video where we are going to be focusing about the central nervous system. But before we dive into the central nervous system, please, if you have not yet subscribed, first subscribe. You turn on the notification bell such that whenever I load a video, you become notified and watch the video. Okay, let's go ahead and get started and look about what we call the central nervous system. In the previous video, we talked about the nervous system as a general introduction, whereby we saw different branches, whereby we had one of the branch which was the central nervous system, and then the peripheral nervous system. We looked at all that. But now today we are going to be just focusing only on the central nervous system. So now, quick reminder, if we can remind ourselves, what is going to be contained in the central nervous system? What are those two structures that make up the central nervous system? And of course, you must be beautiful in mind that we have the brain and then the spinal cord. Okay, we call the brain. So I'll have the brain and then the spinal cord. Okay, so majorly those are the two structures that make up the central nervous system. But now we also talked about what could be the functions of the central nervous system. We said that it is the central nervous system that receives sensory information, does the process of integration and processing and interpretation, and then gives out the motor response. Okay, the sensory input and the motor response, we said they are all part of the peripheral nervous system. We looked at all that, but today we are going to be just focusing on the central nervous system. Okay, we shall just little bit start with the really anatomy of the central nervous system. As you're looking on this structure here, we are seeing that it is demonstrating parts of the central nervous system. Okay, so now looking at this diagrammatic illustration, we want to see which one is the brain and which one is the spinal cord, because those are the two structures that really make the central nervous system. Okay, now the whole of this structure here you are seeing is the central nervous system, consisting of the brain and then the spinal cord. So now we are going to first go a little bit and understand the different structures that make up the central nervous system individually, and we see some of the anatomical areas on these parts. Okay, so now looking at this diagrammatic illustration, we are seeing that the whole of this upper area, this one here, coming up to this end here, the whole of this area from here going up, the whole of that area is what we call the brain. Okay, but again, from this area just going downwards, the whole of that area is what we call the spinal cord. Okay, the whole of this area, from this area going this one is what we call the spinal cord. And again, the whole of this area going up, so what we have said is called the brain. Okay, so now let us have a look at now some of the different parts that make up the brain. Okay, so now the whole of this upper structure, we have just done a sagittal section whereby we are going to be seeing one of the hemispheres, and we are seeing it from the lateral view. Okay, we are just seeing it from the lateral view. These are some of the structures which we can be seeing. So now when you see this kind of the gray matter, this kind of these structures here up here, this part of the brain is what we call the cerebrum. Okay, this part of the brain is what we call the cerebrum. Okay, and of course the cerebrum is going to be now the biggest or the largest part of the brain. Okay, coming on this diagram, on this structure here, which is labeled green, which is drawn in green, how do we call this area? This area is what we call the midbrain. Okay, this one here is what we call the midbrain. Okay, is what we call the midbrain. And then again, below the midbrain, there is this other structure which is a bit trying to be like more of the bulbous structure. This structure just below the midbrain. How do we call this structure? This structure is what we call the pons. Okay, this is what we call the pons. Okay. And then again, below the pons, we have this kind also of another structure before we transition into another structure of the central nervous system, which we are calling the spinal cord. How do we call this kind of last structure as you transition into the spinal cord? They call this structure as a medulla oblongata. Okay, this structure is what we call medulla oblongata. Okay, so now the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, a collection of those structures, we give them another name. Okay, we can give them another name. The whole of these structures here, consisting of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, they are what we call the brain stem. Okay, they are what we call the brain stem. Okay, so now the whole of these structures is what we call the brain stem. So now if someone asks what are some of those parts that make up the brain stem, we have the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. Okay, then again, when we come back to the medulla oblongata, at the posterior aspect, we have another kind of structure. You see this structure, which is a bit labeled in black, this structure here at the back. How do we call that structure? They call that structure as cerebellum. Okay? How do we call this structure here? This structure here is what we call cerebellum. Okay? This structure is what we call cerebellum, and of course this cerebellum is going to be responsible for most of the balance and the posture of the human body. Okay, so now if someone gets a damage with the cerebellum, you're going to be having problems with the balance. Okay, so now these are some of the anatomical illustration of the structures that make up the central nervous system. But of course, the brain had three main parts. Okay, the brain had three main parts. What are those three main parts? The three main parts of the brain, we have the whole of this area here. The whole of this area here. How do we call the whole of this area, which is consisting the cerebrum? We call it the forebrain. Okay, it is called the forebrain. Okay, and of course the forebrain, what's another name? If you don't want to call it the forebrain, what else, what other name can you use to mean the forebrain? We can also call it proencephalon. Okay, so you may call it a forebrain, or you may even call it the proencephalon. Okay, so now in this part of the brain, we are going to be having a lot of structures in them. What are some of those structures that are going to be located in the forebrain? We have what we call the diencephalon. Okay, diencephalon. And of course, in diencephalon, you're going to be having again more other structures. What are some of those structures that are going to be located in diencephalon? We have what we call the hypothalamus. We have what we call the hypothalamus. We have what we call the thalamus, which is the relay station, the thalamus. We also have what we call the subthalamus, subthalamus. We also have what we call the epithalamus. Okay, epithalamus, and very many other structures that make up what we call the diencephalon. And of course, also in the forebrain, we're also going to be having other structures which we are calling the telencephalon. Okay, the telencephalon. And again, in telencephalon, we are going to be having even also other structures. This is going to be much of the more of the outer parts of the brain. Here we are going to be seeing the cerebral cortex. Here we're going to be seeing the cerebral cortex. We're going to be seeing the cerebral cortex, which is going to be now part of the gray, matter. Okay, and again, there are even other structures that you are going to be seeing in what we call the the telencephalon. Okay, so now that is the first part of what we call of the brain. Okay, so now the second part of the brain, you see the whole of this area here. Okay, the whole of this area here. How do we call the whole of this area here? The whole of this area here is what we call midbrain. Okay, the whole of this area here is what we call the midbrain, as we have just labeled it. Okay, it is also one of the parts of what we call of the brain. So now, what are some of those parts that are going to be located in midbrain? There are a lot of structures that you are going to be seeing in what we call the midbrain. Some of these structures which are going to be seen in the midbrain, we have what we call the cerebral peduncle. We have what we call the cerebral peduncle. Okay, cerebral peduncles. We are going to be seeing other structures like cerebral aqueduct. Okay, cerebral aqueduct. We are also going to be seeing other structures like what we call the spiria colliculi. We are also going to be seeing structures like substantia nigra. Substantia nigra. Okay, we are also going to be seeing very many structures which are going to be located in the midbrain. Also have a lot of the nucleus which are going to be located in the midbrain. For example, there is a nucleus called the Westphal-Edinger nucleus. We're also going to be having origin of different cranial nerves, like for example, cranial nerve number 3, which is the oculomotor. All of those structures are going to be residing in what we call the midbrain. Okay, and we may also have what we call the inferior colliculi. So now that becomes now our second part of what we call the brain. Okay, so now the midbrain, it can also be called mesencephalon. Okay, it can also be called mesencephalon. Okay, so now that's also our second part of the brain. So the first one we said is the forebrain, and the second one is what. And then the last one is the whole of these structures located from the starting of the pons going downwards. How do we call the whole of this structure? The whole of these structures located below from the starting of the pons going downwards up to the medulla oblongata. How do we call that area? That part one is what we call the hind brain. Okay, is what we call the hind brain. Again, a hind brain, you can also call it what we call rhombencephalon. So now in hind brain, also part of the brain, we also have different structures that are going to be located in this area. What are some of those examples of those structures that are going to be located in the hind brain? The first one is this one here. This one is what we call the pons. Okay, we have what we call the pons. And then number 2, we have this one here, what we are calling the medulla oblongata. Okay, we have what we call the medulla oblongata. And then the last one, you see this structure which is behind the pons and the medulla. This one is what we call cerebellum. Okay, is what we call cerebellum. So in other words, the hind brain, or what we are calling the rhombencephalon, is containing 3 parts: the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the. So now this makes the third part of the brain. So now the first one we said is the forebrain, the second one is the midbrain, and then the third one is the hind brain. Okay. So now talking about now the brain, that's a really anatomical illustration of different parts that make up the brain. But we have said that the cerebrum is constituting the largest part of the brain. So now let's briefly talk about what we call the extension from the medulla oblongata, which we are calling the spinal cord. Okay. So talking about the spinal cord, what is generally the spinal cord? The spinal cord is like a tube structure. It is a tube-like structure that's going to be extending all along from the medulla down into the lumbar region. Okay, it does not move throughout the vertebral column. It has somewhere it's going to be stopping. Okay, so now when you see the whole of this center area having different colors, that tube-like structure, that's what we call the spinal cord. Okay, the spinal cord is moving all along from the cervical area and moves into the thoracic area, and it is going to be ending in one of the regions which we are calling the lumbar region. Okay, we have different types of regions that make up what we call the spinal cord. Okay, so let's quickly look at what we call the regions of the spinal cord. Okay. Now, when you see the first region of the spinal cord, okay, this black tube here, from this point up to this point, this one is what we call the cervical region. Okay, is what we call the cervical region. Okay, so now the cervical region is going to be from this point up to this point. So now, in between these spinal bones, or what we call the vertebral columns, we have some kind of the spinal nerves which are going to be exiting. Okay, we have these kind of spinal nerves which are going to be exiting and they come out. And of course, the spinal nerve is going to be having the sensory part and then the motor part. Okay, so now, how many spinal nerves are we going to find in what we call the cervical region? Okay, we are going to be finding a total of 8 spinal nerves. Okay, so now you're going to be having spinal nerve 1 up to spinal nerve number 8. So now these are 8 cervical spinal nerves. Okay, they are pairs. Others are going to be exiting from this side and others are going to be exiting from the other side. In other words, the spinal nerves are going to be in pairs, left and then the right spinal nerve, so that they are in pairs. Okay, now from the cervical region, as you move down in this area, this region here is going to be now our what we call the thoracic region. From this point here, the one we are going to be seeing this red tube, from that point up to somewhere this area here, this area is what we call the thoracic region. Okay, so now how do we call the spinal nerves which are going to be exiting from the thoracic region? And of course, they're going to be called the thoracic spinal nerves. How many spinal nerves are going to be exiting from what we call the thoracic region? We are going to be having 12 pairs of the spinal nerve exiting from what we call the thoracic region. We're going to be having the one starting from here. For example, we're going to be having T1 all along up to T12. Okay, so now you're going to be having from T1 up to T12, meaning that we have 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves. Okay, now again from the thoracic region, we are going now to go into our lumbar region. Okay, so now from the whole of this area, going this down here, the whole of this area, from this point here out up to this point here, this one is going to be our lumbar. Lumbar region. So now, if it is the lumbar region, how do we call those spinal nerves which are going to be exiting from what we call the spinal, from what we call the lumbar region? They are called the lumbar spinal nerves. Okay, how many spinal nerves are going to be exiting from what we call the lumbar region? They are 5. Okay, meaning that we are going to be having spinal nerves that is from L1 up to L5. Okay, so now we are going to be having 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves. Okay, but something beautiful is coming here. We said that the spinal cord does not move all along the vertebral column. It has somewhere it's going to be stopping. Okay, so now the question is, where does the spinal cord end? Okay, If you see very well, this kind of the tapering area, the tapering end, okay? The tapering end of the spinal cord. How do we call the tapering end of the spinal cord? It starts to tapering, it starts to narrow as it is ending. They call that area as that tapering area is what we call conus, medullaris. Okay, that area is what we call conus medullaris. That kind of the tapering shape of the spinal cord as it is ending. Okay, but in other words, where does the spinal cord end? Now, the spinal cord generally is going to be ending. The spinal cord is going to be ending between L1 and L2. That is the end point of the spinal cord. Okay, it means if you want to collect a sample of what we call the cerebral spinal fluid, you are going to be targeting not this level, you're going to be targeting like L3 and L4. Okay, in other words, the best site for collection of cerebral spinal fluid for analysis is L3 and L4. So the best site for CSF collection is going to be L3 and L4. Between L3 and L4 is going to be our best area where you can collect the cerebrospinal fluid. Why am I saying this? If you inject a spinal needle between L1 and L2, you are going to inject or you are going to injure what we call the spinal cord. And when you injure the spinal cord, a patient will just jump and not lucky, may even cut off your head because it's very, very, very painful. Okay, so now when you're collecting cerebrospinal fluid, you have to put in mind that in L1 and L2, we still have our spinal cord ending. We should target L3 and L4. Okay. Now, when you see this kind of the tapering end of the spinal cord, which you're calling the conus medullaris, we still have some of the bundles of the spinal nerves. You are seeing these bundles of the spinal nerves which are going to be coming off from this area. You see the whole of this bundle of the spinal nerves. How do we call that kind of bundle of those spinal nerves which are going to be coming from this area towards the end of the spinal cord, but they move all along down? How do we call that area? That area, the whole of this area here, the bundle of these spinal nerves, what we call cauda, cauda equina. Okay, so now cauda equina is going to be like horse-tail. Okay, so it's going to be like moving like horse-tail. Okay, cauda equina is more like of horse-tail. So now these spinal nerves are going to be moving down like horse-tail. We call the whole of the bunch of those spinal nerves as cauda equina. Okay. Now, moving down, we still have this kind of this bone which is going to be having different segments, which is going to be providing exit of some of the spinal nerves. How do we call the whole of this area up to somewhere this down point here before reaching to this kind of this final structure? They call this structure or this region is what we call the sacral, the sacral region. Okay. The sacral region. So now the sacral region is going to be one of the bones which is going to be a bit fused, but it's going to be having a different kind of the segments which is going to be allowing the exit of the spinal nerves. So now how many spinal nerves are going to be exiting from the sacral region? Now the sacral region is we are going to be having 5 spinal nerves. So we are going to be having from S1 up to S5. Okay, meaning that we are going to be having 5 pairs of spinal nerves coming from the sacral region. And how do we call those spinal nerves that are coming from the sacral region? They are called spinosacral nerves. Okay. Then the last one, which is very, very beautiful, it is this last structure here. You see this kind of structure here? This is very important. How do we call the whole of this structure here? Which region of the spinal cord we call this? This one is called the coccygeum. Okay, it is called. How do we call this area? This area here is what we call the the coccygeal. Okay, it's what we call the coccygeal, and it is also a region. Okay, because we have also some kind of the spinal nerve that's going to be exiting from what we call the coccygeal region. So now this one is very much unique in a way that we only have a single pair of spinal nerve that's going to be coming from what we call the coccygeal region. Okay, so now here we are going to be having only and only one spinal nerve. Okay, we are going to be having one spinal nerve, which is going to be coming off what we call the coccygeal region. So now we have seen different spinal nerve, different pairs of the spinal nerve. So now a question is, how many pairs of the spinal nerves are going to be exiting off what we call the spinal cord? This is now a very simple mathematics. We can start counting them. In the cervical region, we are going to be having 8. Okay, we are going to be having 8 spinal pairs of the spinal nerve. In the thoracic region, we are going to be having 12. Okay, we are going to be having 12 pairs of the spinal nerve. In the lumbar region, we are going to be having 5 pairs of the spinal nerve. Then in the sacral region, we also still have 5 pairs of the spinal nerves, and then we have only one from the coccygeal area. Okay, from the coccygeal area. So now simple mathematics, how many pairs are we going to be having exiting from the spinal cord? They are about 31 pairs. They are 31 pairs of spinal nerve. Okay, in other words, the peripheral nervous system is going to be using 31 pairs of the spinal nerves alongside 12 pairs of the cranial nerves. Okay, it's going to be using 31 pairs of the spinal nerves and 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Okay, so now in other words, to send our sensory information to the central nervous system from the peripherals, the peripheral nervous system is going to be using 31 pairs of the spinal nerves along with the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Such a beautiful thing that's making us to get the sensory information to the central nervous system for a corrective motor response. Okay. So now, looking again at this tube. This tube, it has some of the thin membrane which is going to be around it. And that kind of membrane is going to be protecting this tube which we are calling the spinal cord. How do we call that kind of the membrane which is going to be wrapped on the spinal cord in the sense of protecting it? How do we call it? We call that kind of membranes as meninges. Okay, we call them as meninges. Okay, we call them as meninges. So now, what are these meninges? These are meninges. They are going to be layers which are going to be wrapped along with the spinal cord, and even not only the spinal cord, but generally the whole of brain and then the spinal cord. These layers are going to be wrapped around to provide what we call protection and other different functions. So let's quickly talk about some of these layers. However much I shall have a full video which is going to be talking about these layers. But let's mention them. There are going to be 3 layers or 3 meninges that are going to be wrapped along with the spinal cord. The first one, which is going to be in line, which is going to be in contact, the deepest, which is going to be in contact with the spinal cord, is what we call the pia mater. Okay, is what we call the pia mater. Okay, so now coming off from the pia mater, we still have now another second layer which is called the arachnoid mater. Okay, is what we call the arachnoid mater. Okay, now between the pia mater and arachnoid mater, we have a very beautiful space. How do we call that space? That space is what we call the subarachnoid space, and it is within the subarachnoid space that you're going to be finding our fluid which we are calling the cerebrospinal fluid. Where is it going to be located? In subarachnoid space. Okay, so now the last fibrous, most tough layer which is going to be outside is what we call the dura. The dura mater. It is very, very, very tough. Okay, it is very, very, very tough. Okay. That briefly covers some of the anatomical illustrations of the different parts of what we call the central nervous system. So let's have just a very quick recap about what we talked about. Okay, we have said that the central nervous system is going to be made up of what we call the brain and then the spinal cord. We have said that the brain is going to be the whole of this structure going up. We said that the whole of this structure here, if we have just made a sagittal section, we are looking it from the sides. The whole of this structure, which is having the gyrus and then the sulci, the whole of this area is what we call the cerebrum. Okay. We have said that this green structure here, we have said is what we call the midbrain. And then below the midbrain is another structure which we are calling the pons. And then finally the down one here, which is red, is what we call medulla oblongata. We have said that behind the structure, behind the pons and then the medulla oblongata, we have this structure which is super important in balance, which we are calling the cerebellum. Okay. We went ahead and said that a transition from the medulla oblongata downward, we have this kind of the tube that moves all along and it ends between L1 and L2, which is the lumbar region. We call the whole of that tube as the spinal cord. We went ahead and said that the brain had three main parts. We have the first one, which is called the forebrain. Of course, the forebrain is going to be made up of what we call the diencephalon, we have what we call the telencephalon, and a lot of the structures in the cerebrum. Okay. We also went ahead and said that the forebrain can also be called the proencephalon. Okay. We move to the second part of the brain, which we call the midbrain, which can also be called the mesencephalon. Okay, we said there are a lot of structures which are going to be located there, like the cerebral aqueduct, the cerebral peduncle, the substantia nigra. We are going to be having the superior and the inferior calculi, which are going to be responsible for auditory and visual reflexes. We're also going to be having different types of the nucleuses, like the Endiger-Westphal nucleus. We're also going to be having exit points or the origin points of some of the cranial nerves, like cranial nerve number 3, which is the oculomotor, and a lot of structures are going to be located in that area. Okay. We said that we also have another third part of the brain, which we are calling the hindbrain. We said that the hindbrain can also be called the rhombencephalon. We said that there are three structures that are going to be making what we call the hindbrain, which is going to be the pons, medulla oblongata, and then also the cerebellum. There are three parts that are going to be making up what we call the hindbrain, which is cerebellum, pons, and then the medulla oblongata. We also talked about that the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata collectively they make what we call the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem having what we call the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. Okay. Moving away from that, we also talked about the spinal cord. We talked about the spinal cord being the tube-like structure that's going to be a transition from the medulla oblongata, moving all the way down and ends in what we call the lumbar region around between L1 and L2. We said that the vertebral column is going to be having different regions, and of course our spinal cord is going to be having different regions. We said that we have what we call the cervical region, which is the first one up. It is going to be having 8 pairs of the spinal nerves. Okay, the 8 pairs of the spinal nerves are going to be from C1 up to C8. Okay, they are called cervical spinal nerves. Okay, then we said from the cervical region we still have the thoracic region. We are going to be having 12 pairs of the spinal nerves, and we said that these thoracic region spinal nerves, they are called thoracic spinal nerves. Okay. We moved ahead and said that after the thoracic region, we have the lumbar region. The lumbar region is going to be having 5 pairs of the spinal nerves. And we said that it is the lumbar region whereby we are going to be having our spinal cord ending. We said that that is going to be ending between L1 and L2. We expect the spinal cord to end in that area. We said that that kind of tapering end of the spinal cord on L1 and L2, we call that area as conus medullaris. We said that we have these kind of bundles of the spinal nerves which are exiting from the conus medullaris, which like horse tail. We call that one as the cauda equina. We also went ahead and said that the best area where you can collect the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be L3 and L4, because there we don't expect to be piercing or injuring what we call the spinal cord. Okay. We moved ahead and said that we have another region which we are calling the sacral region, which is going to be a fused bone but it's having different segments allowing exit point of different spinal nerves. We call these spinal nerves as sacrospinal nerves, and they are a pair of 5 spino-sacral nerves. And then lastly, we said that we have 1 pair of the spinal nerve which is going to be coming from the coccygeal region, which we are calling the coccygeal spinal nerve. We also talked about now how many total of the spinal nerves are going to be coming go from what we call the spinal cord. We totaled 8 from the cervical region, 12 from the thoracic region, 5 from the lumbar region, 5 from the sacral region, and then 1 from the coccygeal region. We came up with 31 pairs of the spinal nerves. We said that the 31 pairs of the spinal nerves and the 12 pairs of the cranial nerves, they are the wires, they are the nerves that are going to be transmitting sensory information to the central nervous system and also carry out some of the motor response to the effectors, like for example the glands, the muscles, and then other structures for corrective changes. We finalized by saying that the spinal cord is going to be having kind of membranes which are going to be wrapped along it. We said that the one which is the innermost membrane which is going to be in line with the spinal cord, we said it is what we call the pia mater. It is very thin and it's very in line with the spinal cord. We said that the second layer after the pia mater is what we call the arachnoid matter. We said that the space between pia mater and the arachnoid matter is what we call subarachnoid space. And we said that it is within the subarachnoid space that we are going to be having our cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? And then we summed up with the last layer, which is going to be very tough, fibrous, which is going to be the outermost meningeal layer, which we are calling the dura mater. So there are 3 meninges, which is the pia mater inside, the middle one arachnoid mater, and then the last one outside, which we are calling the dura mater. Okay. So now this really covers the simple anatomical illustration of the central nervous system. We have just talked a lot of things, but we shall come later and talk all the meninges. We see those spaces which are going to be located there, the subarachnoid space, the epidural, the subdural. We shall look at that one all in detail, okay? But today it was just more of the anatomical illustration of some of the different parts that make up the central nervous system, okay? Okay, a lot has been discussed. And if you think whatever I've talked about is really making sense, you are benefiting from it, please, you can support me. And you can support me by a couple of means. How are you able to support me? Make sure you like the video. After liking the video, just comment down in the comment section. You can share this video to any person that you think this video is very much helpful. And of course, don't forget to subscribe at the end of it all. Thank you very much for watching. It has been TUMNAD as always. Until we meet next time.